This is Metabolic Mastery, a KORR Medical Technologies podcast dedicated to advancing knowledge and practice in metabolic testing. Hello and welcome to another episode of Metabolic Mastery, brought to you by KORR Medical Technologies. I'm Dr. Mark Humbert. This is my co-host, Dr. Cameron Garber, and today we're going to be talking about designing test protocols. So this is going to be part of a series that we're doing on this. So we'll first go over kind of the theory and the rationale behind the test protocols, and then we'll go into actually what should some of the specific test protocols look like and how do we want to design those ideally. And so to start out, let's dive into the different type of testing that we can do. So we can do RMR, we can do VO2 testing, we can do what we call VO2 long testing. We'll get a little bit more into that. But Cameron, will you go ahead and kind of define those, like what they are, why they're important, what's the usefulness of graded exercise tests for looking at these things?
Yeah, well, so we've titled this episode "Test What You Intend to Measure," because honestly, that's the key: is making sure that the way we're setting up the test design is really intended to measure what you're hoping to measure.
Yeah.
Right. And so really, really critical. So we have a couple different ways of testing. We have our resting metabolic rate test, which is really important that you set that up so that you're getting a true resting metabolic rate, that people are rested and all of those things. So yeah, if we're trying to test what we intend to measure, making sure that they're in a rested state is going to give us a better resting metabolic rate. Same idea with testing with an exercise test, some kind of graded exercise test. If our goal is to get a VO2 max, you want to run the protocol that you're following in a way that's going to get you the best possible VO2 max. If your goal is more designed around getting substrate utilization, so finding out how they're burning fats versus carbohydrates, finding out where certain physiological points are in how they're exercising, whether that's their fat max point or their metabolic efficiency point or different terms within the industry.
There's a lot of terminology.
so many terms that honestly, unfortunately, are often poorly defined or are used synonymously, and then wind up having either the same or different definitions depending on who's using it. And so we'll dive into that a little bit. Lots of definitions.
So many.
But VO2 testing is essentially looking at oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production, VO2 and VCO2 testing. And so there's different ways that you can do that. So we have that type of test, and then we've got our VO2 long, which is basically a data collection mode, which is an open-ended testing mode where we can look at how many calories is somebody burning, where we can look at what is their oxygen consumption or carbon dioxide production look like with longer efforts or with maybe not a graded exercise protocol. You could really test in any way and just collect data and see how is their metabolism being affected by whatever stimulus you're putting them through. Yeah. And so those are the three primary test modes from the KardioCoach, style of testing. And then within those three primary testing modes, there's a lot of different ways you can test.
Well, and so again, that goes back to, we're going to say this a lot, test what you intend to measure. And so, the perfect protocol for VO2 max test is, as Cameron mentioned, not necessarily the perfect protocol for substrate testing, for fatigue resistance, for any of these other tests that we'll get into.
Right.
And so again, knowing beforehand, what are our goals? What are the metrics that are important to us? What do we want to find out is really going to help us tailor the protocol to select for that specific metric.
Right.
And so let's now talk about what's the benefit of protocols. What's the benefit of standardizing testing in the first place?
Oh, yeah. So it really is helpful if you're testing something and want to see how is my body going to make a change in that thing, right? So it's good to get a baseline, but the way we test that baseline, if we want to compare apples to apples later when we test again to see have I made any changes, a protocol can be really helpful in making sure that you actually have a baseline and then a progress, and you're comparing the same things so that we can see how did we do. Because if you've got a completely different workload or a different ramp or speed or things like that from test to test, you may not be comparing the same things together. And so it may look like you are doing better, but you may have just had an easier protocol. So at that same moment in time, it's actually looking better because you were actually only going 3 miles an hour instead of 6 or whatever, So helpful to standardize that so it's reproducible and so you can compare with future things. Anytime you can standardize that, it's helpful. So there's, standardizing with an individual patient, but then there's also standardizing for a population. So you have standardized tests like the Bruce protocol, USAF, SAM, the bulk you wear. I've heard that pronounced a million different ways. I always call it bulk, but bulky wear protocol. There's a bunch of other too, depending on, you'll find in different research articles that they set up their protocol for that research article. And it's great. All of them can be helpful. And that way you can standardize it from person to person as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's important to remember about, like, especially the population ones, is when people start testing, they wonder, like, which one should I use? Where should I go? And again, what are you looking to find? And what does your testing population look like?
Right.
And so sometimes we look into the methods of that research study and how the protocol was designed and who it was used on. And that might be wildly different than the population that's being tested.
Right.
And so a lot of the protocols that were validated in the early years of exercise testing were performed on, kind of healthy, athletic, college-aged males.
Oh, so many studies were done with like the track team at different universities. And that's where a lot of these protocols come out of.
Yeah.
And so even like the Bruce protocol, you have the Bruce ramp, the Bruce modified, and often you'll have different levels of those as well. So even the Bruce team decided to create different variations on the theme.
There's variations. So just really understanding the person that you have in front of you, what are their goals? And again, what are you looking to measure, and designing it around that so that you make sure that your test is first doable. Can they even stand up to the demands of the test?
Right.
Or is it actually way too easy for them? And so then we're not selecting for what we want to measure. So adapting it to them. And then am I going to be testing the thing that I'm actually looking for is super important. And I think this is where the having the different modes is nice, because with kind of the VO2 test mode, it's very standardized, right? We're going with that specific protocol.
Yeah.
Whereas, and that's very nice for repeatability, but it doesn't always necessarily mimic exactly what's going to happen out in the field. What are they doing during training? And so that kind of data collection mode is really nice, so that if we want to run them through a workout, right? Like, let's do an interval workout. Let's do a fast finish workout, whatever it is. Then we can see how their body responds to those different types of workouts. And as we'll talk about later, this can help us to understand what does their conditioning look like and what might they need to emphasize to improve what they're doing.
Absolutely. I love that data collection mode, the long form testing mode, because it allows us to say, like, is what I think is happening in somebody's body what's actually happening in somebody's body? It gives us some confirmation there and can be really helpful, especially when training elite athletes or people who are struggling. If somebody's really having a hard time and not being very successful, you can put them on that and help kind of show them. We often call testing like our lie detector, right?
Yeah.
Are you really training this way? Because we should be seeing some adaptations. And oftentimes when I've done some open-ended testing and ask people like, yeah, go ahead and you can adjust the treadmill however you feel like you need to get in your zone and stay in your zone too, and things like that. And if they don't know how to do that, if they're not very comfortable with that, and they're like, I don't know, what was my zone 2 again and stuff, then it's like, okay, so we haven't really been doing this.
Yeah.
And so that can be really helpful sometimes, just to see, are people really doing what we've asked them to do? But then it can be very helpful in confirming whether or not it's working as well.
Yeah. And so to your point, one of the things before we bring people in, and again, we'll talk about this later, but knowing what their training looks like, knowing what their activity looks like, is really going to help us in selecting the right protocol for that person.
Yeah.
How many days do you exercise a week? What's the intensity at which you exercise? What's your mode of exercise? As
Right.
we'll get into in a little bit. And so having some of those pre-testing questions is really going to help us dial in what's the right protocol for them that is enough to, challenge their body to get to the range that we're looking for. And so not have it be too difficult, not have it to be easy, right? We're looking for the Goldilocks zone
Yeah, exactly.
with these protocols.
Exactly.
Real quick before we dive a little bit more in, let's talk about some of the things that we do to standardize graded exercise testing. And so both before the RMR, before the VO2 testing, why are those things important? Things like fasting, things like avoiding stimulants, things like that. Why is that important for standardizing the test? How does that help us?
Well, essentially, you want to eliminate as many variables as you can. The more variables we have, the more it's hard to say this is their true baseline. So if you've got, one time you tested them, they took a pre-workout, and the next time they didn't, or they had it's interesting. I had a guy do oatmeal versus eggs and bacon, and the difference was significant, especially in the first few minutes of the test. And so he wanted to try a shorter test protocol, but had just had oatmeal and never burned any fat. And it was like, well, you did a really short test protocol, so you never were able to get past kind of the carb burning in your bloodstream to actually see where you were burning fat. And so we did this really short protocol just for getting VO2 max. But that's why a VO2 max test may not be great for setting zones if we want to look more at substrate utilization. And so a little bit different test protocol to get the thing that you want to get. So the more we can eliminate variables like room temperature even, or really anything, humidity, temperature, hydration levels, food, what they've eaten and how recently they've eaten, all those types of things. So many different variables that we can control, whether or not it's an incline versus a speed protocol. Are we climbing a big hill or are we going really fast? Depending on what they are training for and how they have been training, it's all going to adjust that. And so the more we can eliminate variables, the more accurate of a baseline this will be. And then we can test against that baseline with some of those variables to see how those things affect their body.
Yeah. So bottom line, control as much as you can control and make it repeatable. Test to test is what we're really looking to do so that we have confidence in consecutive tests.
Yeah, well, you can extrapolate so much more from a really good baseline because you're not relying on those factors, those other variables. And so then you can extrapolate more as to what that test means versus, and this is what I don't love about field testing, right? With some portable units and things, the more you're out in the field, the more you're just testing those variables of that day, right? If you're doing it out of doors with wind, it's going to cause a lot of noise in the flow sensor, things like that. But you're also going to have, temperature, humidity differences. You're going to have differences in direct sunlight versus indirect sunlight. You're going to have all kinds of different variables when you're outside versus inside in a lab. We can control those variables, and we're testing apples to apples when we retest.
Yeah, love that. Okay, so let's dive into the setup of RMR testing. So let's look at how long do we want those tests to be, and then what method do we want to choose for getting the RMR.
Mm-hmm.
So we need a certain baseline level, right? So typically we need at least 10 minutes of data to get a valid test. But talk about when that works well and when we may want more time in testing.
Yeah, so some of that honestly has to do with the flow of your gym or clinic. What are you looking for? If you're time crunched, that's usually when I see people set a 10-minute time limit. So you need at least 5 solid minutes for it to really get a good data set to be able to analyze for the resting metabolic rate test. And so most of the time we set it in our clinic, we set it for best 5, meaning the computer will find the best 5 minutes when they were the most calm, where all their graphs, their breathing rate, their respiratory rate and volumes and everything were the most steady. So when we look at the graphs and see the lines, it picks when it was the most flatlined. And so that best 5 method is really helpful because it picks for you where that best 5 was. And so the hard part is with a 10-minute test, if they don't calm down for the first 5-6 minutes, then you may not have as big of a window of time. So a lot of the time I recommend, and this is what we do in our clinic, we set it for 20 minutes and then auto end the test. So as soon as it has that good 5 minutes, then the test will end. So it's variable. Sometimes you'll have a 10-minute test and sometimes you'll have a 20-minute test. But as long as they have a good solid 5 minutes, that's what we need. That's what we're looking for. But there's also, you can choose it if you feel like in your clinic setup, the way things are happening, that they've actually been able to calm down and they're pretty relaxed beforehand. You can choose the first 5 method, the last 5 method. If you're doing a 10-minute and you always want it to just pick the last 5 minutes, great. Or the best 5, or you can choose the Douglas bag method, where it collects all of the data from the whole thing. So explain that a little bit. We had a case recently where we recommended to somebody that they use the Douglas bag.
Yeah. And so in that case, when there's just, as Cameron said, the best 5 minutes is looking for that cleanest data. But if just kind of the whole test is peaks and valleys and it's not really consistent, doing the Douglas bag method can just smooth that out a little bit more, right? It's averaging all of those breaths. And so we can get a little bit more stable data. Because what happened in this other test is that the best 5 minutes, there was still a lot of variability in that shorter time period. And so it changed the accuracy of it, right? It was much different than kind of what was there expected and what they tested with the last time.
Yeah.
And so in those cases, changing the method that we look at can actually smooth that data out a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And so really a lot of it is depending on their ability to relax, which is why I really like the longer test times. So Cameron is really good at relaxing. Like yours are often closer to that 10-minute. I am just not great at relaxing. So I'm almost always that full 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. It just, I don't know, being alone with my own thoughts or something.
I can turn my brain off really well.
Yeah, Cameron just goes on default.
Power down.
Yeah, power down. And so if you have a clientele or if you found a protocol that helps people relax really well, then great. And that best 5 minutes is probably going to work really well for you. But if people have a hard time relaxing or because of clinic flow, that test time is constrained and you just have a lot more variability, then doing something that averages out those breaths might actually be a little bit better.
Yeah.
And so it's really kind of what are your goals? What's the clinic design? And feeling confident in the data that you're giving clients. And that's really what we want to do with any of this is we want to feel confident as clinicians that we're giving our clients the best results, the best action plan to go and make decisions off of.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, just having that really dialed in and choosing the method that allows us to get consistent, repeatable results is really what we're looking for.
Yeah, that's the idea, is that it's consistent and repeatable.
Yeah.
And so that's really helpful. Obviously, there's the pre-test protocol of making sure that they're fasted, rested, no strenuous exercise right before, things like that. All very helpful. But then our actual test itself needs to follow a fairly standardized procedure as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So now let's do the same thing for our kind of VO2 protocols. The biggest thing there is really, and people often ask this question, is the staging. How do we set the stage length, right?
Yeah.
Is it 1 minute stages? Is it 3 minute stages? So I love the way that you look at it. So kind of talk about what are the pros and cons of each, and what's the method that you use that kind of allows you to
hybridize.
Yeah.
Yeah. So 1 minute stages versus 3 minute stages. Again, it really depends on what you're looking to measure. A lot of people like to do the 3 minute stages because they want to have somebody get to a steady state prior to bumping up to the next stage.
So real quick, define what is a steady state. What does that mean?
A steady state essentially means that they've stopped climbing. So their heart rate, their respiratory rates, things like that will climb. When we make an adjustment, it'll climb a little bit and then it'll level out. and then we bump up again once we've reached that steady state. And so depending on what you want to measure, sometimes you want to see that steady state before bumping up. Personally, I like to get a really good snapshot of the entire heart rate range. And I find with 3-minute stages, to be able to do the test in a timely amount, you wind up having bigger jumps. And so sometimes you'll skip 5 beats per minute or 10 beats per minute, and you'll often see a bigger fluctuation in metabolic values as well in some of those jumps, especially kind of right around that like 50-50 fat and carbohydrate burn. Sometimes you'll see a big jump where you'll go from 2/3 fat and 1/3 carb burn to 2/3 carb and 1/3 fat burn. And so I like to feather that a little bit more. One of my big goals of testing is to always get a very linear heart rate increase, to where that heart rate line is very straight and that it's not too stepwise. And so I prefer that because I feel like we don't skip over something. So that's my personal bias, is I just make each increment small enough that you're slowly creeping up instead of steady state kind of shelves. And so we're creeping up slowly enough to get through each of those zones and those stages instead of reaching a steady state. And so either way is valid. It just depends on, does it line up with what you're trying to test? And so especially when I'm looking at substrate, I like to use 1-minute stages and just use smaller jumps versus a 3-minute stage and bigger jumps, so that the same amount of like increase was had over those same 3 minutes in the increase in intensity. It's just that we went through that a little bit more slowly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're just getting a little bit more granular. And so I think that's the thing, is it's 1-minute stages, but smaller jumps. And sometimes those 1-minute stages will be like a little bit bigger jumps. We're just trying to get the test done really fast.
Right.
And so when we just extend that out and make the test a little bit longer, then it can kind of refine that data, and we get that more linear increase.
Yep.
I think one of the test cases when people tend to use the 3-minute stages too is if they're going to do lactate testing as part of that, just having that longer steady state period can just make it a little bit easier for getting the actual blood sample. Whereas when we're doing just the 1-minute stages.
I honestly think that's where the 3-minute stages probably comes from, is doing blood pressures and lactate testing. It allows you to like, okay, it looks like we're at a steady state. Let's hurry and take a lactate and a blood pressure in that steady state, and then we'll bump up.
Yeah.
That's probably where that came from and why that's kind of the standard with a lot of your standardized protocols. And so, it's definitely a way to do it, especially if you're doing lactate testing and blood pressures.
So again, test what you intend to measure, right?
Yeah.
I want to find out lactate. I want to find out blood pressure. I'm going to do a little bit different of a protocol so I can select for that.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So now another big question that we get often is, what should our warm-up look like? Do I do that before the test? Do I build that into the test protocol? What's the rationale behind that?
Yeah. So the problem with doing too much of a warm-up, I guess, is that you can be a little too amped up. You haven't brought your CO2 back down, your heart rate back down, all of those things beforehand. But a warm-up kind of across the board is actually really, really important for avoiding injury and potential problems. It's always good to do a cool down on a warm up. Very, very important. But also, I guess there's several factors from just tuning up the machine so that we're testing again what we intend to measure. We're typically less concerned, unless we're dealing with a sprinter or something like that, about the first 3 to 5 minutes of exercise. We're more concerned about steady state exercise or longer efforts to see how is my body responding under those conditions. And so to do a minimum, I would say, of a 5-minute warm up to I've seen warm ups as much as 15 to 20 minutes. Again, depending on what you want to measure, I don't think that's inappropriate. I found that a longer warm-up really does help get a little bit better test results. You can build that warm-up into the protocol if you want to, depending on your test length. So you can actually have that be built into the protocol. and measure that so you can see them kind of peak up and come back down and all of those things. Or you can just slowly ramp up and watch that warm up, or you can do the warm up and then hop into the test. Either way, both work. If you're doing the warm up inside of a protocol, just know that your protocol is going to be a bit longer that way. And so you have to factor those things in. And that may be more appropriate for a long form test if it's going to be a really long protocol, or if you're going to do a warm up and then bring them back down and you want to actually see those values get back to baseline before you start a more graded exercise test. That long form testing mode is going to be really good for that.
Yeah. So with the warm up, Cameron mentioned several times kind of bringing those values back down.
Yeah.
The difficulty if we don't do that is that as we do exercise, especially the more intense the exercise gets, the more that we have to buffer the CO2 that's released as part of metabolism.
Yeah.
And so that actually falsely elevates kind of the metabolic CO2, and we have buffered CO2, right? So we have the CO2 that's produced by our cells as they process energy, but then because our exercise creates certain metabolic byproducts that can change the pH of our blood. Our blood has to be tightly controlled, right? Our whole body has regulatory mechanisms, homeostasis, right? We talk about that, keeping those ranges within the right level. And if our blood gets too acidic or too basic, major problems. And so what our body does is it buffers that. So it makes the blood less acidic, and then we breathe that out as additional CO2. And so if we haven't come down from that workout enough, we'll be kind of falsely elevating that CO2, thinking that it's coming from our metabolism, and it's actually coming from that blood buffering.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the thing to understand is if we do a warm up, we want to have enough recovery, and it doesn't have to be a super long time. Like we usually come down pretty quickly within a few minutes. But giving ourselves long enough, and then choosing the intensity. So for some test protocols, we want to have a little bit more of an intense warm up. For other test protocols, that doesn't matter as much. We're really just looking to get the body moving.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. Well, so there's always a little bit of a lag too in. Especially the more fit somebody is, the more adaptable they are. So the more fit someone is, you'll see their heart rate rise and lower more quickly. So same thing is true of our metabolic rate. We're going to see that rise and lower more quickly. The more fit we are and the more fat adapted we are, the more we tend to see that somebody can kind of do a warm up and then cool back down and their body gets back to normal more quickly. It's actually a test we'll talk about later that I like to do is to see when I peak up and then cool back down, how long does it take for me to kind of reset and get back into my fat burn?
Awesome. And so with warm-ups, again, what we're really looking to do is kind of increase body temperature, increase tissue temperature, increase the elasticity of my muscles, and just get everything prepped for moving. We're also prepping our nervous system to do the testing. And in some cases, it's like I'm burning off a little bit of that blood sugar that's circulating, and so I can get more stable readings of what's really happening with my fat oxidation.
Yep. That's exactly. Yeah. So, getting prepared for that state. Yeah.
And so in terms of that recovery period of coming back down after the warm up to test, it's kind of easy to, if we do the warm up beforehand, then we can just do that during the calibration period, right? We have them do their warm up, turn the machine on, let it calibrate, and then that's often enough time for people to do that. Versus, again, it's just built in if that warm up's built in, and then it goes right into the test.
Yep.
Okay. So now, again, test what you intend to measure.
Yep.
And so we have a couple of different, we have a number of different tests that we can run, but we've grouped them into kind of two groups. And so kind of outcome specific and then mode specific. So let's go over some of those just a brief overview of those different outcome specifics, and then let's talk about the modes after that. So starting with VO2 max, tell us a little bit about the VO2 max test.
So VO2 max test, the number one thing here is you can't let it get too long, or you're probably testing their legs more than their lungs. And so you really want a shorter test duration typically. So it's going to ramp up, well, either ramp up in terms of elevation or speed, but you're going to try to max them out relatively quickly, ideally between like 8 and 12 minutes. So it's a progressive overload. So a stage test where each stage jumps fairly aggressively, and the goal is less about substrate utilization and more about, can we get them to a true, or as close to a true maximal state as possible, to where their amount of oxygen consumption, how much oxygen they're consuming, levels off. That's actually considered a true VO2 max. It's usually a fairly uncomfortable place to be. At a true VO2 max, it's very close to passing out for a lot of people, or throwing up, or things like that. And so it's an uncomfortable place to be if we're at a true like VO2 max. But within the clinic, we can get really, really close to that without quite taking it to that uncomfortable place and get very accurate values. And so that's a fun part of that testing is to see what people are capable of physiologically and really push themselves. So that's the goal there of a VO2 max test, is usually 1 or 3 minute stages, but we're typically seeing it ramp up fairly quickly, fairly aggressively, and getting very hard for them.
Yeah, and what we really care about is that VO2 max.
Yep, that's the main metric.
Yep. Okay, let's look at substrate utilization. What are we dialing in there, and why is that different than VO2?
Yeah, so a bit different there. We want a slower ramp up because we want to look at each phase along the way, like at each heart rate, range or a few beats, how efficiently are they burning fats and carbs? Like how much are they actually, or at what rates are they burning calories at, so that we can get a better look at what does each stage look like during exercise. Helps with exercise prescription and game planning with races and all kinds of other things. There's lots of ways that we can utilize that. We can use it for optimizing fat loss and reducing fatigue and injury rates, all kinds of data points that we collect with that. And so the key is a slower ramp up so that we can collect more of that data and make sure that we feel like we have a good sample at each heart rate range.
Yeah, just giving us more resolution of the data.
And zooming in a little bit more.
Yeah, exactly. Love it. Okay. Fatigue resistance. This is a really interesting one.
Yeah, so fatigue resistance is a cool concept. Honestly, relatively new, and relatively new to VO2 testing. But the idea of going in at a steady state for somebody. So going in their zone 2 and saying, how long can I stay there before we start to see some drift? So how long before I fatigue and actually drift out of my zone 2?
Yeah. Well, I think that's an important thing to understand about zones, is that while they are heart rate based, to a degree, they're time based, right? It's like, if we're in zone 2, I can probably stay in that zone a lot longer before I creep up to the next zone, right? Before I end up having to work at a higher percentage of my body's capacity to sustain that amount of work, versus the higher that we go in those zones, right? Zone 3, zone 4, zone 5, I'm going to be able to spend less time there before my body can't handle that steady state more, and it has to do more work to keep up that pace or keep up that amount of workload.
Right. So, I mean, even if we're in zone 2, we're still utilizing some carbohydrate, some electrolyte, a fair amount still, right? And so we're still depleting resources, and then just depending on how well tuned my body is to that, as we utilize resources, there's only a finite amount of time that we can be in that zone. And so that's essentially what we're looking at. You can have two people that have very similar heart rate zones. So I would say right now, as probably a prime example for me personally, my heart rate zones, I haven't been running as much as I normally do. And my heart rate zones actually haven't come down very much. So I'm still about 145-ish last time I tested was where I was still at the top of my zone 2. My guess is that hasn't really come down much more, but my amount of time that I can stay there has probably come down as I haven't been running quite as much. We're just getting back into the summer when I tend to run a little bit more, kind of periodization of training and things. I don't run quite as much during the winter time.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that would be my guess. I'd have to go and test it, which would be kind of fun.
Yeah.
But to look at how long can I stay in zone 2 before that really starts to creep up? That's basically what that concept is. And so doing a long form test where we look at that and see how does the metabolism change and how, as that heart rate creeps up, how do things look? Really fun.
Yeah.
Kind of to differentiate between athletes that way. Looking at fatigue resistance, you may on paper look very similar, but one is able to still keep burning fat for hours and hours, where one is creeping up at that same workload and intensity rate.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just another reason why we want to test regularly, and depending on what we're looking for, we might want to find out more information, right? It's like I did my VO2 max test or I did my substrate test and I found my zones, but like, how is that actually going to look during workout or during race efforts or whatever? And so having all these different ways that you can test just allows us to get a lot more data and individualize the training plan to the person a lot better. Because no two individuals are exactly the same. Like you mentioned, you could have the same general heart rate ranges, but how long can you persist in those ranges does vary greatly from person to person. And so,
right,
you and your friend both get tested. The way that you need to train might still need some more fine tuning to really optimize for the adaptations that we're looking for.
Right. Well, you may have a higher VO2 max, even if you're, similar height, weight, age, all those things. You may have a higher VO2 max than your friend, but then they beat you in a race, and it's like, what's going on? Why did he beat me? I'm more fit than he is, from a VO2 max standpoint, but they may have improved fatigue resistance, which may have a lot to do with muscle fiber types and muscle density and all kinds of other physiological factors. So to be able to test that, really, really kind of cool.
Yeah. Well, so I remember looking at some of the stuff. So Kipchoge, in terms of lab values, like he was good, but he wasn't necessarily like
off the charts.
Mm-hmm. Whereas other people that got tested were, but then in the actual race conditions, he beat them, right? Like he performed so much better. Like he's such an incredible athlete.
Right.
Because it's not just one metric. It's what does the combination of all these factors look like when I'm actually doing the thing.
Right. Well, and that could honestly be something as simple as he's better at turning his mind off than everybody else.
Yeah.
So he's burning fewer mental calories. Your brain burns a ton of calories. And actually during racing, if your mind is too active, you can actually impede performance because of that. So it could be something as simple as that, as he's just better at turning his brain off. I actually heard recently of certain racing teams would have their athletes train in a corner where they're just like 4-hour rides staring into a corner on bike racing and things, because it was super boring and they had to learn, in a 100-mile race, you're left alone with your thoughts mostly, and you have to be able to just turn off all the like, oh, my foot is sore, my hip is this, and my whatever. You have to be able to turn all of that off and just cruise. And so fatigue resistance could be coming from a lot of different factors.
Yeah. Well, I think that specific point is really interesting because it really tells us that we can't separate psychology from physiology, that what's going on in our mind and our experience of the thing has a huge impact on our performance and on our recovery.
Yeah.
And so anyway, interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
One more thing to add that isn't necessarily related to the protocols, but of kind of that fatigue resistance idea is when we set the heart rate zones, right? It's this, lower end to the higher end. And people love to just push it at that higher end.
Yeah.
Which makes sense, right? It's like, oh, well, I've really got to be towards the edge or I'm not doing anything. I think it's hard for us to can I just stay in the middle? Can I be okay with that?
Right.
We want to be at the top. But if we're always kind of redlining that zone, then we're a lot more likely to push it into the next zone, the next level of intensity, which reduces the amount of volume that we can handle at that intensity. And so it reduces the chance for adaptations. We get less stimulus and we need more recovery.
Right. Well, so that, we alluded to earlier that there's like testing to look at a fat max point versus testing to look at metabolic efficiency point. And metabolic efficiency point, depending on who you're talking to, often is around like a 50-50 fat and carbohydrate burn, which may not necessarily be the highest number of fat calories that you're burning. And so that's why some people look at the fat max point instead of the metabolic efficiency point, because they're looking at where do I burn the highest number of fat calories? And let's hang out there instead of right at that 50-50 or top of zone 2, if that's how you set your zone 2. Again,
we'll talk about that in a future episode.
Yeah. There's a lot of different ways of how people set zone 2, but that, using that fat max point as the target heart rate instead, because that's where you burn the highest number of fat calories. That's where you theoretically should be able to go the longest period of time with training and reduce injury and all those things.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.
Getting off in the weeds there. Easy to do. This is exciting stuff.
Totally. So let's talk about, I think this is such a cool test. Let's talk about the zones confirmation test.
Yeah, I love doing this. So oftentimes when you have somebody who doesn't believe you, when you tell them about their zones and zone training and like, oh, if I go out and do this, will it really work? I love to have them do a zone confirmation test where I say, go and run 3 to 5 miles, depending on their running volume. It may be 1.5 miles or whatever, but it's typically I do this usually when I'm trying to get an experienced runner on board with running slower, because they're like, it just feels so much slower than I'm used to and whatnot. So I say, go out and run for 3 miles at that zone 2 pace. And then at the end of that 3 miles, I will have calibrated the machine and I want you to run right into the clinic and we'll have the treadmill ready to go and we'll put it into the long form testing mode. And we'll like, as soon as you run in, we'll put the mask on while you're still running on the treadmill at that same heart rate. And it's so fun to watch, and it's spot on where their fat burn was during their zone testing. And so to just prove it to them that like that really is working, that really is your zone, that's where you're burning optimal amount of fat, things like that. I've done that multiple times with multiple people, and it works really well. And it's really fun.
Well, and so that goes back too into the psychology of what we're doing, because anytime that we're making a training change, that can be really difficult for people to grasp mentally, right? Mm-hmm. I've been doing it this way. Why should I do it this way? Or this is really hard. How do I do that? Or, oh, well, what is my, I don't know about that metabolic efficiency, or I don't know about that fat max, right? And so being able to show
when
them,
it's lower,
especially when it's lower, right? Because we all want to think that we're the best at everything, right? And so being able to show them in that case and be like, hey, I know this is difficult. I know this is a big change for you, but like this actually is going to be doing what we want to be doing, right? This is selecting for the adaptations that we're looking to select for. And so if you can just have the patience to spend time here, it's going to make a world of difference.
Yeah.
And using that data to show them how to play the long game, right?
Exactly.
And if I really want to improve performance over the long term, then I'm going to train differently. If I want to just live a longer, healthier life, I'm going to train differently than kind of the standard way that we often train. And so being able to look at that type of testing and say like, no, these are your actual zones. This is what's happening in your body, even when you've gone and done a run beforehand. I think it'd be super helpful for like psychological buy-in and demonstrating the data actually is valid.
Right. Well, and it's really helpful at helping people accomplish the goal that they're looking to accomplish. If my goals are more short-term focused of, look, I'm less concerned about avoiding injury and things. I want to see maximal performance improvement. We can do this testing and see, okay, this is what you need to do for maximal performance improvement. If your goal is, I want to still be exercising 30 years from now, and so my goal is more longevity and avoiding injury, but still making progress enough that I'm fighting off aging and all of those things, we can do this testing to find out exactly the right way to do that for your body as well. So really, if you're exercising, especially anything's kind of steady state cardio, you need to do testing. You need to be tested. If you're working with patients who do steady state exercise, you need to be testing them. If you're working with people who are looking to lose weight, you need to be testing them. And so it's so important because we always say, and I may have said this in a previous episode, but doing cardiovascular exercise without knowing your heart rate zones is somewhat akin to lifting weights without knowing how much weight is on the bar. It doesn't mean that you can't get a good workout. You just have no idea if you did or not.
Yeah.
And so you can't monitor workload. You can't really monitor fatigue levels or, how I did today versus yesterday if we don't know those values and can't see how we're changing. And so it's not that you can't get a good workout. You just don't know if you did or not.
Yeah. It's being able to quantify it and then say, again, is my training doing what I intend it to be doing? And am I getting enough recovery in?
Right. Am I progressing safely? Just because I can do it doesn't always mean that I should. I can run a little bit harder and a little bit harder every time I go out and run up to a point, and then I plateau and get injured.
Yeah.
That's what we typically see is people start out and they run just a little bit harder every time they go because their capacity does increase somewhat, especially initially, until fatigue sets in, until recovery isn't quite adequate. And then we see some injuries and other things creep in. And so that's the idea is how do we make sure we're still progressing while kind of feathering that progress, backing off just a little bit to make sure that our body can recover enough that we can actually progress through plateaus and injuries and all those things and make our progress more linear with fewer setbacks and problems. And that's what testing really allows us to do and why it's so important to test what you intend to measure so that you can make sure that what you're doing really does line up with your goals.
Yep. Like we talked about on a prior episode, that we're matching our efforts to our goals.
Yeah.
And do those align.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so now let's look at the zone recovery test. So we talked zone confirmation. Now, zone recovery test, what does that look like? Why are we doing that? What are some interesting things that we're finding out with that?
So I love this test too. It's another fun one to do with people. So zone recovery test, I alluded to it earlier. Something where, so for me personally, I like to do trail running. And so sometimes my volume of training is more about speed and other times it's more about climbing. And so if I want to see how well do I recover from each training mode, as well as do my heart rate zones differ a little bit from mode to mode because I'm using different muscle groups. You can kind of test that. And so one of the things I like to do for me is I'll do one where I do just speed. And so I'll increase using speed until I kind of cross over that 50-50 fat and carbohydrate burn. And then I calm back down till I'm just about to zone 1 again. So let everything calm back down and let my fat burn kind of normalize to where it normally is with my heart rate. Then I do it with just incline. So the speed's not too high. I get to a brisk walking pace and then I just smash it with incline and go straight up like I'm hiking up a really steep hill at a fairly aggressive pace until my heart rate, gets outside of that, top of zone 2, that 50-50 fat burn. Then I bring it back down again and see how long does that take to recover and all of those things, kind of get back to baseline. And then I'll often do a hybrid of speed and incline together. And the time it takes to recover is a good metric of how adapted I am, as well as or do all my heart rate zones. I like it personally. I like to be more well-rounded with it when my heart rate zones are pretty spot on, where the top of zone 2 is kind of even with both speed and incline. If I was doing more road racing, I'd want the speed to be the bigger factor, where I was stronger in running fast. If I was doing more mountain activities, I'd want that to be where I really am dialed in and efficient. But I kind of like staying at where it's a little bit of both.
Yeah. Well, and so like you mentioned, we were talking before the episode of it can help you find out, am I conditioned for the thing that I want to do? So
Right.
if you don't handle incline well, you don't recover as quickly, that might not matter if you're doing a pretty flat road race.
Right.
But if you're going to be in a mountain race or just mountain training, that's going to make a world of difference. And so
Right.
finding those responses and knowing, am I conditioned or am I not, can help us say, okay, well, this is now the area that I need to work on. I'm good here. I've got a good baseline. Now I need to improve this metric.
Right. So I look at like some of my friends on Strava. I've got a few in North Carolina or Tennessee and things. And some of those folks they'll go on a 5-mile run and they'll have like 15 feet of elevation change or 50 feet of elevation change. And, most of my morning runs are on the low end, 400 feet of elevation change up to 1,500 feet in like 3 to 5 miles. Yeah, it's just different. I live on a mountain. I live at the foothills of a mountain. And so it's not uncommon to get, 1,000 feet of elevation change in 3 to 5 miles or 1,500 feet in 3 to 5 miles. And so it just depends on what I'm training for. And you can adapt your body to where that feels just as easy as running feels if you adapt your body to running from a 10-minute pace to an 8-minute mile pace. You can make those adaptations so that feels just as easy as 10 minutes used to. Same, you can kind of adapt to where climbing isn't as taxing. And so it's just making the adaptations for whatever your goal is.
Yeah, love that. So then kind of this type of testing, the last major bucket is that just data collection mode. And so as we talked about before, that's where I maybe want to run them through a specific workout. We're going to do an interval workout. Or we're going to do a fast finish workout, or we're going to do a steady state workout. What happens during kind of the average length of their workout. But then we can also test their responses to different stimuli. Mm-hmm. So talk about Bach versus rock.
Yeah, that was a fun one that we did. So you really can be creative with how you want to use that data and test really anything that you want. So looking at variations in someone's metabolic rate with any stimulus. So my son, we did Bach versus rock for his science fair project, which was really fun. So we had brought in all his cousins and friends and everything, and I showed him how to use it and test the device. And this goes to show you how simple the KORR CardioCoach is to use. I trained, I think he was like 10 or 11 at the time. It's been a minute. Yeah, he's probably 10 or 11. Trained him how to do the testing in just a few minutes, and he was able to test all of his friends and cousins and whatever. Because Dad has to stay out of it as much as possible so that Dad's not winning the science fair, right?
That's the one.
Yeah, don't want to be one of those parents. Anyway, it was really fun to see how Bach music affected people versus rock music. So both had a slight metabolic increase just from not being in a totally rested state, which was actually really interesting for me to see.
Yeah. That
it still stimulates the brain a little bit, just even just to listen to the Bach music, right? Yeah. One of the fascinating outcomes we found. So with the rock music, everybody's was fairly amped up, except for like 13 to 15-year-old boys. That's where it flipped, where something about that age range of boys, and we didn't test any older kids. 15 was about the oldest that we tested. That, and I always tease this about my boys, that their brains fall out between 13 and 15 and they kind of become dumb for a few years and stuff. We have some evidence that actually did happen. So they often fell asleep to the rock music. So it was Enter Sandman by Metallica. And like the teenage boys fell asleep often during that, but then were totally irritated by the Bach music. Which was fascinating. And we did have one little girl cry because of Enter Sandman. So I felt a little bad that we chose that. Anyway, really a fun...
Dangers of testing.
Right. But it really was fun to see and use that open-ended testing mode to see like a very different way of testing, but to look at any stimulus and how it can affect our body. And so really, really pretty fun. And you can use it in any different way. So that's not exercise specific, but just any other task. So really anything you want to test, you can test in that long form mode.
Yeah. Let's now talk about the kind of mode specific exercise. So we've talked a lot about the different protocols, but what equipment are we performing those protocols on? How are we designing that phase of things?
Well, yeah. So like we've talked about with everything else, where you want to be as specific as possible, so you're testing what you intend to measure. The piece of equipment that we test on can be really critical as well, because your test results aren't really translatable from one piece of equipment or one activity to another. So for example, if I like to cycle, a treadmill test isn't going to get me my accurate heart rate zones or be reflective of what my metabolism is doing when I'm cycling. And so we have to be careful there. So if we're looking at a VO2 max test just for our health and fitness and to see where we're at, you can test on any piece of equipment. That's totally fine. You may get a little bit higher on your favorite piece of equipment if that's what you do, just because you're more well trained for that. And you're going to have less psychological like fatigue and irritation, or like it won't be quite as uncomfortable if you're used to being uncomfortable on a bike. Whereas if you're not a cyclist and you do a bike test, and you're not used to your legs burning like that, that may be a little bit more.
What is this new pain?
Yeah, exactly. Whereas we kind of get used to the types of discomfort that we do regularly. And so that's okay. Again, if we're doing a VO2 max test just for our general health, doesn't matter as much. But if we're looking for substrate utilization, if we're looking for fat max points or things like that, or if we're just trying to get accurate heart rate zones for somebody for their exercise, those heart rate zones really are only good for that activity. And so if I'm rucking, or if I'm cycling, or if somebody says, well, I primarily exercise at the gym on the elliptical or the stair stepper, if we can, ideally it would be best to test them on the elliptical or stair stepper so that we can give them heart rate zones for that activity, versus testing on something else and hoping that they're close enough, which for the most part, they're not going to be wildly different between an elliptical and a treadmill, but there will be some differences. Or rucking versus just walking, hiking, adding a pack actually does make a bit of a difference. It does often lower those heart rate zones a little bit. And so you have to test what you intend to measure. So if you've got somebody that rucking is their primary activity, when you book that appointment, it's often good to ask them then, what are you testing for? What are we looking to do? So that we can make sure that they bring their rucksack and they bring, I like to test people if that's their primary mode of exercise. Wear your backpack, wear your rucksack, and let's test that if that's what we're training for. And so as much as possible to become as specific as possible so that you're in testing again what you intend to measure.
Yeah,
that's important.
Yeah, it definitely keeps coming back to that principle. And kind of the why behind that is with these tests, we're looking at what's happening with their metabolism during the movement. And so because these different activities are going to change the pattern of muscle activation, what muscles you're using, but also the way that you're using them is going to change mode to mode. And so if we're wanting to know, like, hey, how does what's happening at a cellular level impact my breathing rate, my heart rate, right? All those different values, then testing on that actual equipment is going to more closely reflect what's actually happening with the physiology and how does that reflect in all those other values. And so yeah, it's because we're using our bodies a little bit differently, using more or less muscle mass, activity to activity, that those values are going to change. And so, if we really want to dial it into their physiology, then we want to know. Again, we want to test what we intend to measure.
Exactly.
Okay, so that obviously a lot of different types of tests that we can do, but I feel like that gives us a really good overview of all of the different types of tests that are available. And like Cameron said, it's kind of up to your imagination, right? What do you want to test? And then how do we, control that well enough to test that? But there's so many different things that we can look at, so many different responses that we can look at. And so hopefully that's given you a good intro of what these tests look like. What we're going to do in the next episode is we're actually going to look at how do we design those different types of protocols? What do we want to look for? What do we want to be aware of? And so we'll dive in a little bit more to that. Any final thoughts? Any big picture overviews?
No, again, that test what you intend to measure really is that's the overarching principle. So really deep think that with how you're setting up your clinic or gym or wherever you're testing, however you're testing. How do I serve my clients best by the way that I test? And we'll dive into that in this next episode of, do I do, custom protocols for every single client, or do I have a whole set of protocols that I try to fit people into those boxes? We'll talk about all of that good stuff coming up in the next episode. So stay tuned.
Yes.
Look forward to seeing you on there.
As always, remember to like, follow, subscribe to get more of this content, and we will catch you on the next episode. This podcast is a production of KORR Medical Technologies. Ready to take your metabolic testing to the next level? Visit KORR.com to learn more about purchasing our metabolic test equipment.